So as I mentioned, I now want to add a card component and then work on the meal items. Now I will start with the card. And for that, in the UI folder, I will add a card.js file. Attached, you also find a card.module.css file with some styling for that card. And this will be a super simple component. It will just be a wrapper component, which provides some HTML structure and some CSS code for any content you want. And therefore, this is a component which could be used in very different places throughout the application, which is why this is such a general UI component. It wants some props because we will need to access props children to get access to the wrapped content. And of course, we export it here. We will also need some styles, so we can import classes from card.module.css already. And now in here, I want to have a very simple markup. We'll just return a div here, which then wraps props children, so that whatever is passed between the opening and closing tag of the card component is in the end used inside of card. And on that div, we can then add a class of classes.card using that CSS class I defined here. And that's it already. With that back in the available meals component here, I want to use that card to wrap this unordered list. So here we can import, and we should import card from going up one level, UI card, like that, to make that component available in this file. And with that imported, we can simply wrap our unordered list with card. And if we do that and save everything, this already looks much nicer. Now, of course, the meal items don't have the final look I want to have. And therefore, I will add a new component in the meals folder. But to make sure that we don't have too many components sitting side by side here, I will actually add a subfolder meal item. Now, if you add a subfolder or not also comes down to your personal preferences. I'm doing it here, again, to group all the components that will be dealing with rendering a single meal item together. Because it turns out that I will actually build two components for rendering one meal item. And you will see which components these are in just a second. So in the meal item folder, which is in the meals folder, I will add a meal item.js file. And attached, of course, unsurprisingly, you find a meal item.module.css file with some styling. And then here we can create our meal item component, which receives some props. So our component function. And of course, export it. And now let's work on the markup for these meal items. For that, I will return a list item. That's the wrapper around every meal item, which semantically makes sense because all these meal items will be rendered in an unordered list. So having li elements makes a lot of sense. But inside of that li element, I then want to have two divs side by side. And in the first div, we'll have a h3 tag where I want to output the name of that meal. And I expect to get that name through props because we are rendering these meal items for all the meals in the dummy meals array. So therefore, here in the meal item component, I will now access props.name. Of course, on which prop you expect to get that name is up to you. You could also name this props.title or .n or whatever you want. It's your component, so it's up to you which props, which attributes, you could say, should later be set on that component. You just need to make sure that whatever names you're using here to access the data are the prop names you later use in available meals for passing down the data. So here I will go for props name, and I will reformat this. And below that h3 tag, I'll add a div where I want to output the description. And I'll Therefore, access a description prop here. Again, the prop names are up to you. And another div with the price. However here, I actually don't want to access props price like this, but instead I will add a little constant here before we return, which I'll name price. And this constant will simply format the price a little bit. For this, I'll use a template literal and output a $sign, and then use this special syntax with $sign curly braces. So we got two $signs here, one simply to output the character $sign, and one in combination with the curly braces to inject dynamic content into this template literal. And the dynamic content I want to inject is props.price.toFixed2. And this will simply make sure that we always render 2 decimal places. And then it's this price constant, which I'll output here in this div. Simply to output this formatted price with 2 decimal places and a $sign in front of it. And then here in this second div, I want to render a simple form which allows users to enter the amount you want to use here, the amount of meals you want to add to the cart, and then the Add to Cart button. And that's this extra component which I'm going to add. A component which holds this form to not have all this form markup and logic in this component. So therefore here I will already add a meal item form.js file, and we'll work on that in a second as well. Before we do that though, let's work on the styling for the meal item. And therefore, since we already added the CSS file, I will import classes from mealitem.module.css. And now here on the list item, we can add a class name of classes.meal. On the div here for the description, I will add a class name of classes.description. And on the price, it's class name classes.price. And that's the meal item finished now. Now, before we work on the form, we can already use the meal item in the available meals component. There at the top, we just need to import meal item from /meal item to dive into that meal item folder, and then again meal item to access the meal item file in that folder. And then here, where we map our dummy meals, we now can map them to a meal item instead of a list item. So meal item like this as a self-closing component. And there we now should add a key. We should have added this before as well with the list item, but it was just temporary. But now we should definitely add it and access meal.id here, because every dummy meal has an ID. And I will also pass in the name prop, because in meal item, I am accessing the name. I'm also accessing description and price. And therefore, I will pass in the name with meal.name, the description with meal.description, and the price with meal.price. And I'll reformat this to make this easier to read. Now, if you preferred that, you could also pass in the overall meal instead of these separate props. And inside of meal item, you would then have to access props.meal.description and so on. I'm not doing this here, but this is an alternative you could definitely go for. But I will go for the separate props here. And with that saved, we should have something like this already. Now let's work on the form, which should appear here on the right, for adding them to the cart.